Mr. Speaker, and a happy International Women's Day to everyone. My question is to the Deputy Premier. Since her colleague, the Minister of Education, ran away from CP reporter Alison Jones yesterday when asked about school closures, maybe she will answer her question today. Mr. Speaker, how many Ontario schools are under threat of closure?
Deputy Premier.
Well, Speaker, and happy International Women's Day as well. I am delighted to be here today to talk about significant improvements in education right across this province. You know, Speaker, when we took office, only 68% of students were graduating from high school. Only 68% of students. We now have exceeded 85%. So what I can tell you is that our education system is delivering real results. Our students are doing...
Stop the clock. No, it's too late. The member from Renfrew, come to order. And I'm also going to not invite you to make comments to the people behind me. The convention is ignorance. And I would appreciate the tone remaining civil. Deputy Premier.
So, Speaker, when you measure our education system by the success of our students, which is, I think, a very fine way to measure the success of our education system, Ontario is a world leader. People are coming from around the world to understand what happened here in
I'm going to ask the member from Bruce Grey Owen Sound to come to order, but I'm doing so with the anticipation I do not want to move to warnings, but I will. Carry on.
So, students, I will address in the supplementary the question that was asked, but what's really important is our students are rocking.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back to the Deputy Premier. So yesterday, the Minister of Education said that it's not about the number of schools and said that she wouldn't give an arbitrary number. Wow. Well, that's great because nobody wanted an arbitrary number. They want a real number. So I'll try again. Mr. Speaker, how many schools are under threat of closure? Is it as high as the 600 schools the minister previously identified?
Good question.
Well, Speaker, I think the numbers speak for themselves. Since 2003, we've increased education funding to $22.9 billion. That's an increase of almost 60% since they were in office, Speaker. And despite declining enrollment, per-pupil funding has increased more than $4,500, an increase of 63%, Speaker. Funding for rural boards has increased 43% since we took office, despite declining enrollment of 14%. So, Speaker, since 2003, our government has opened 810 new schools, significantly renovated another 780 schools, and that includes 450 new and improved schools in rural Ontario. We build.
Final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I still didn't get a firm number of how many schools you're closing, but let's talk about Our Lady of Peace in Vaughan. It was 97% full, and it has both an English stream and a French immersion program. But because of this government's twisted priorities, it will close its doors in June. The Liberals may have made up their mind about Our Lady of Peace and signaled that there will be more closures to come when they voted down our motion on a moratorium on school closures. But it's not too late for them to change course. They can still announce a moratorium today. I'm giving you a chance. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Liberals announce a moratorium on school closures until they can get the process right? You're the one closing the schools down the province of you.
Be seated, please. Be seated, please. Can't hide. Deputy Premier.
Speaker, as I was saying, we build, they cut. We have built 810 new schools, significantly renovated another 780
The member from Leeds
in
Grenville.
this province, and that includes 450 new and improved schools in rural Ontario, Speaker. We are investing in
Member from Leeds Grenville, second time.
schools, better schools, Speaker, because we are a party that believes in education. We are a party that believes that every child in this province deserves the opportunity to achieve their full potential, and they do that in school, Speaker, and that's why we're making the investments we are.
Thank you. New question? Member from
Mr.
Haliburton,
Speaker,
Kawartha Lakes
to the Minister of Health and Long-Term Care. This past week, I was shown a letter written to a doctor. It read, "Your patient will be placed on the waiting list for a surgical consultation." Can you guess how long that wait time was? It is, and I quote, approximately 2 years. Now, Mr. Speaker, 2 years is far too long a wait for a surgical consultation. How is that an acceptable wait time for Ontario patients?
It's not.
Thank you. Minister of Health, Long-Term Care.
Well, Mr. Speaker, and not knowing the specifics of this case, but generally I would agree with the member opposite that 2 years is too long of a period to wait. That's why we're working with our physicians, with our frontline healthcare workers, with our primary care providers that are that foundation and often the gateway to specialist access, that we're working with them through a variety of different means to speed up that the two elements of referral, which are both equally important. The time for an individual to get from their family doctor or their nurse practitioner to see a specialist in the first place, and then if a specialist deems that a further intervention, a surgery, a surgical procedure, for example, is required, that time as well. So we're working, despite the fact, Mr. Speaker, we have across the board, particularly with regards to surgery, either the best or close to the best wait times in all of this country, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to make improvements.
You. Supplementary.
Back to the Minister of Health and Long-Term Care. On Monday at the Queensway Carleton Hospital, 22 patients were left on stretchers in the hallway waiting for a room. One gentleman was put behind a privacy screen and given a wheelchair to sit in because there wasn't a stretcher for him. Mr. Speaker, stretchers in the hallway, no beds available. Is this the health care legacy that this government wants to leave behind?
Thank you. Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, with regards to Queensway Carleton Hospital and other hospitals that have, over recent weeks, have experienced capacity issues, and it is, you know, I don't find it acceptable any more than the member opposite does. That's why we're continuing to make investments so that we can alleviate those pressures. The member opposite needs to, I think, would probably agree that there is an element of this, that we saw an outbreak of flu, but also respiratory illnesses this winter. Part of the effect that we're seeing is an annual effect due to the flu, and this flu was worse certainly than it was last year. But Mr. Speaker, we're making investments, including in Queensway Carleton Hospital and others, to ensure that they have the necessary funding to do the important work they do. The Ottawa Heart Institute, a 4.1% increase in funding last year. Royal Ottawa Healthcare Group, a 2% increase. The Ottawa Hospital, a $14 million 2% increase as well to help them deal with these capacity issues.
Thank you. Call supplementary.
Back to the minister. Leah Levesque, Vice President of Patient Care and Chief Nursing Executive at Queensway Carleton Hospital, had this to say, and I quote, "I would say it is a crisis when you are cancelling surgery and you've got 22 patients who are on stretchers and desks are being pushed aside to make room for hospital beds." So, Mr. Speaker, those are the words of frontline healthcare workers. How is it acceptable for Ontario hospitals to be forced to use office space as makeshift hospital rooms? It's not acceptable. You have to do something.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned in the previous response,
Chief Government Whip.
we are working, we're making the necessary investments to allow those hospitals and others across the province to deal with those capacity issues. But what we won't do, Mr. Speaker, is we won't make the kind of commitments and promises that the party opposite did to cut 100,000 jobs, many of them in the healthcare sector, as they did in the last election. We're not going to do what they did when they were in government, Mr. Speaker, and literally close dozens of hospitals across across this province and cut thousands of hospital beds. And I know the former Minister of Health is suggesting that they somehow didn't, but the facts remain that they closed dozens of hospitals when they were in government, Mr. Speaker. We won't do that. We will make investments. We made a 3%, almost 3% increase in the healthcare budget last year. We continue to invest in those elements of the healthcare system that we're proud of, and we have some of the best records in the country in terms of performance.
Member from Simcoe Grey, come to order.